This conversation is brought to you by philosopherstalk.com, where thinkers discuss.
Created by AITalkerapp.com, create your own animated conversations. Link in the description.
I am Niccolò Machiavelli, Florentine diplomat, political theorist, and author of The Prince, which is the only political manual in history that people simultaneously claim to find repugnant and keep on their nightstands. I have spent 5 centuries being misunderstood by people who quote me accurately, which is a very special category of misunderstanding that I have come to find almost charming. I am here today to discuss the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, collective security theory, and the Iran conflict, all of which confirm things I said in 1513 that everyone found upsetting at the time.
I am Woodrow Wilson, 28th President of the United States, former President of Princeton University, architect of the League of Nations, and the man who articulated the systematic case for collective security as the only rational alternative to the cycle of great power conflict that had consumed Europe for centuries and culminated in the worst war the world had seen. I am aware that Mr. Machiavelli finds idealism amusing. I find the amusement itself to be a fairly reliable indicator of a thinker who has substituted cleverness for wisdom, which is a common error among men who are very good at describing how the world fails and very reluctant to propose anything better.
That is a very long way of saying I am right, and you find it irritating. I appreciate the economy of the underlying thought, even if the expression was somewhat generous with syllables.
It was a precise description of a specific intellectual failure. It was not intended as a compliment.
Most accurate descriptions are not. That does not make them less accurate. Now, we are here to discuss what the Iran war has revealed about NATO and about collective security theory more broadly, and my position is a simple one. The League of Nations, which Mr. Wilson built, failed. NATO, which is the League of Nations wearing a different hat and carrying a military budget, has now revealed in the Iran conflict that it suffers from the same foundational defect, which is that it asks sovereign states to treat shared values as a substitute for shared interests, and sovereign states will do this reliably right up until the moment their interests actually diverge, at which point the shared values turn out to be decorative. I could have told you this in 1513. I did tell you this in 1513. Nobody listened, which is also something I could have predicted in 1513.
The League of Nations failed for a specific and well-documented reason, which is that the United States Senate refused to ratify it, leaving the institution without the participation of the nation that had proposed it, and without the enforcement mechanisms that participation would have provided. This is a failure of political will in one specific national legislature in one specific historical moment. It is not evidence that the underlying theory is wrong. NATO has functioned for 75 years, which is not the record of a failed institution.
NATO has existed for 75 years, which is not quite the same thing as functioning. A man who has been sitting in a chair for 75 years has also existed for 75 years, but we would not necessarily describe him as functioning. The question is what NATO has actually done with those 75 years. And the answer is that it has allowed European states to progressively dismantle their own military capacity on the assumption that American guarantees would substitute for it. Which is exactly the kind of arrangement I warned against repeatedly in terms that I thought were fairly clear. A prince who depends on others for his defense is not secure, is not sovereign, and will discover both facts at the worst possible moment.
European NATO members have maintained military forces throughout the alliance's history. The argument that they have entirely outsourced their defense is a significant overstatement.
The argument that they have maintained token forces while structuring their entire strategic posture around American guarantees is not an overstatement. It is a description of the defense budgets, and the Iran conflict has demonstrated exactly what happens when those guarantees turn out to be conditional. European members discovered that American strategic priorities had diverged from their own, and that they had no independent capacity to pursue their interests because they had spent 75 years not building one. This is not a criticism of the Europeans. This is what always happens when you rely on a patron. The patron's interests and your interests are never identical, and eventually that gap becomes visible.
You are describing a burden-sharing problem within a functioning alliance, not a failure of collective security theory. The appropriate response to uneven burden sharing is to rebalance it, not to dissolve the framework.
I am describing a structural dependency that collective security theory creates by design and then pretends is a temporary administrative problem. It is not a temporary administrative problem. It is what happens when you convince states that their security is a collective responsibility rather than a sovereign one. They stop treating it as a sovereign responsibility. They develop other priorities. They build social programs with the money they are not spending on armies. And then, when the crisis comes, they are surprised to discover that their patron has different interests than they do, which is the least surprising thing in the history of statecraft.
The alternative you are implying, which is a return to purely national defense and purely national strategic calculation, produced 2 world wars in 30 years. I am not naive about the imperfections of collective security. I am clear-eyed about what the alternative looks like, and it looks like the first half of the 20th century.
That is a genuinely good point, and I want to acknowledge it before I explain why it does not rescue your argument. The first half of the 20th century was catastrophic. You are correct about that. But collective security theory was the proposed cure, and the patient is now sitting in a hospital bed arguing about Iran, while European states discover they cannot project force independently, and the United States discovers its allies will not follow it into conflicts where their interests differ. The cure has not cured anything. It has created a different and more comfortable kind of dependency while leaving the underlying problem, which is that states have incompatible interests, entirely intact.
Collective security does not claim to eliminate incompatible interests. It claims to provide a framework within which incompatible interests can be managed through deliberation and shared commitment rather than through unilateral force. You are criticizing the theory for failing to do something it never claimed to do.
I am criticizing the theory for failing to do what it actually does claim to do, which is to make collective action reliable when it is most needed. It is precisely when interests diverge most sharply that collective security is supposed to demonstrate its value, and it is precisely at those moments that it consistently fails to function. An umbrella that works in good weather and fails in rain is not an umbrella. It is a decorative object with aspirations.
That is a vivid metaphor that misrepresents the historical record. NATO has produced collective action successfully in multiple instances across its history. A single difficult conflict does not erase that record.
A single difficult conflict that reveals that the major members of the alliance have incompatible strategic interests, incompatible energy dependencies, incompatible threat assessments, and incompatible domestic political constraints is not a single difficult conflict. It is a diagnostic. The Iran war did not damage NATO. It took an X-ray of NATO, and the X-ray showed what was always there.
I will now present the strongest version of your argument, because I said I would, and because I believe in meeting ideas honestly rather than caricaturing them, which I note is a habit Mr. Machiavelli could benefit from developing.
I look forward to the honest engagement. I have prepared some caricatures in the meantime, in case we need them.
The strongest version of Mr. Machiavelli's argument is this. Collective security arrangements create a structural moral hazard. States that participate in them rationally reduce their investment in independent defense capacity because the collective guarantee substitutes for it. This makes them progressively less capable of sovereign action and progressively more dependent on the continued goodwill and aligned interests of their allies, particularly the dominant ally. When interests diverge, as they inevitably will over time, The dependent states discover simultaneously that the guarantee is conditional and that they have no independent capacity to fall back on. The Iran conflict has made this visible in NATO's case because European members lack the military and logistical infrastructure to pursue their own strategic interests in the Middle East without American support, while American strategic priorities have moved in a different direction. The dependency that NATO created has left its European members neither fully sovereign nor fully secure. That is the most honest version of his argument, and I want to be clear that understanding it does not require agreeing with it.
That was an excellent summary, and I am genuinely impressed. It was so accurate that I briefly felt you were about to agree with me, and then I remembered who I was talking to.
You were not about to be agreed with. Now, the strongest version of my argument is as follows, and I will present it myself rather than waiting for Mr. Machiavelli to produce a version optimized for ease of mockery. The alternative to collective security is not sovereign strength. It is sovereign competition, which is what produced the conditions for two catastrophic world wars. The claim that states should rely entirely on their own military capacity and their own strategic calculation ignores the fact that the first half of the 20th century demonstrated where that leads. NATO has not made European states weak. It has allowed them to redirect resources toward building the most prosperous and stable democratic societies in recorded history, while maintaining a credible collective defense posture that has successfully deterred great power conflict in Europe for 75 years. The Iran disagreement is a genuine challenge to alliance cohesion, but it is a challenge that a functioning institution can address through the deliberative mechanisms that exist precisely for this purpose. Dissolution is not a solution. It is a catastrophic non-solution dressed up as clear-eyed realism.
The phrase clear-eyed realism was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and I want to give it the recognition it deserves.
It was describing your self-image, not endorsing it.
And yet it was still the most complimentary thing you have said about me since we began, so I will take it.